Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the second community workshop for the Colfax Bus Rapid Transit Project. We're thrilled to see such a good turnout. And if we get started right here at the top of the hour, we've got a lot of folks in the waiting room still coming in, but we're going to jump in with a little housekeeping. So for tonight, all of our attendees, because we have a big turnout, are going to be in listen-only mode. We want to get as much feedback as possible through the chat. And we've got several built-in Q&A portions of the meeting where we'll be answering as many of your questions as we can via the chat. We've also got an app that we're going to be seeking some feedback on tonight on some station design. So we're really excited for what we have to share with you. And as I said, I'm your host, Miles Graham, so you can submit your questions to me or any of your other co-hosts here in the chat, and we'll address them as we go. So with that, let's jump right into the fun stuff. And I'm going to turn it over to our project manager, Brian Pinkerton.
All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you for taking your time to be with us tonight. We're pretty excited to talk with you about the Colfax BRT project again. We're going to give you just a real brief project status so that we can allow enough time to get into some of the other things. Just to catch you up to speed, for those of you that have participated in our first community workshop, it won't be a lot of new information in that project status. We'll be saving the new stuff for later in the meeting. We also have been actively engaged in soliciting input from the public, and we'll be going over a summary of that kind of input that we've been receiving. And then a real thrust of tonight is to start talking about station design themes. So what these stations along, especially, along the corridor in particular between between Broadway and Yosemite, what the different alternative ways to build a station would be and what those would look like. And then also very important is we want to talk with you about next steps and what the coming workshop that we're probably going to schedule in sometime in October or early November, what the topics will be there. We got some real important technical data that we're going to want to share. So that's kind of what we're looking at for tonight. I'm going to go ahead and do some introductions here. You can see some of the agencies that are working with us. We have RTD and CDOT and the Federal Transit Administration, and the City of Aurora is an important partner with us. We have a community task force made up of some stakeholders and business improvement districts and other community leaders that kind of help give us some guidance and feedback on the project. And we have equity and accessibility partners as well. To do introductions, let me start with some of the staff in the City of Denver. Again, my name is Brian Pinkerton. I am a principal project manager. I am the project manager for this project on the city side, and I am with what we call DOTI, which is the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure within City of Denver. And Mike, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Mike Gill. I'm the Director of Transportation Project Management and the principal for this project.
All right, and we have a special guest with us tonight, Councilwoman Sawyer. I believe I saw you in the waiting room. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hey, oh, can you guys hear me? Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Amanda Sawyer, Councilwoman for District 5. Thanks for doing this. Looking forward to learning about it.
Thank you. All right, so let's see. Do we have any other folks from Denver on the call tonight? Do we have David Kretzinger? Or I'm seeing a head nod. David, if you're here, can you please introduce yourself? David, if you introduced yourself, you may have been on mute, so we'll need you to do it again.
Well, it looks like we're having some audio challenges. So David, it shows that you're unmute. I see you talking and you're smiling, but I can't hear anything. So we may need to sort that out on the back end.
All right. Well, for now, I will introduce David. David Kretzinger is our transit director for DOTI in Denver and working with us on this project. Okay, let's see. Is there anybody else I missed from Denver? And if not, CDOT, do we have anybody, or I'm sorry, from RTD? We have Susan Wood on the call. Susan, would you introduce yourself and anyone else that we have from RTD?
Hi, everybody. This is Susan Wood. I'm not sure you can hear me or not.
We can now, yes.
Oh, good. I had a little trouble unmuting for some reason. Anyway, I'm an environmental planner with RTD, working on the Colfax project with Denver and FTA and CDOT, and glad to be part of the meeting.
Thank you. Do we have Brian Welsh on the call with us?
I don't believe Brian is with us tonight, Brian.
Okay, that's right. I think I did see that he's out this week. Okay. Do we have anybody on the call with us from CDOT? And if not, I don't believe we have anybody with the FTA from us tonight, but from City Aurora, I believe we have Tom Worker Braddock. Tom, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Tom Worker Braddock, City of Aurora, Senior Transportation Planner. Glad to be here.
All right, thank you. Just a little bit more. So we have a great consulting team helping do the work on this project. You obviously know Miles. We'll have a couple other presenters tonight besides myself. One is Alex Arrett and one is Kevin Ashby, and they will be covering their respective topics in a little bit. So I'll let them introduce themselves when we get to their topics. All right, we can go ahead to the next slide. Okay, again, just a brief project update. For many of you, you'll have seen this before. This is a graphic showing a few things to just kind of highlight, refresh your memory from previous meetings this year. One is, of course, the center running BRT section is between Broadway and Yosemite, that area in blue there on the map. You can see the stations that we have honed in on for the BRT. The green dots represent stations that have been added since the alternatives analysis from a couple years ago. If you look on the left side of that graphic, you can see that the BRT will, on the west end, go through downtown and connect with Union Station and back. In previous iterations, we'll see a graphic here in a minute. In previous iterations, it had been contemplated to take at least one piece of the BRT route and continue west on Colfax to Federal Decatur. In doing some of the preliminary modeling analysis, we see that the ridership increases dramatically with an all downtown destination. That does then create the question, what happens to those riders on West Colfax? And we've been working real hard with RTD to look at that and in fact think that the system would function really just fine with that Colfax Route 16 to the west, and then with other routes that go from Denver Union Station down to Sunnyside. So we're looking at that from a number of perspectives: the number of riders, the attractiveness of the service, the equity of the service, and all things considered, we think this is a really good solution to maximize ridership on the Colfax BRT and still not harm any other travel and mobility desired. On the right side of that graphic there in the orange, you can see at the Aurora border, you can see some of the stations that are tentatively on the map there. We are on an ongoing process with our partner in Aurora to kind of finalize the station locations there. We've got a few different options that the consultant team has thrown out that Aurora is looking at. In general, the service there will cover the same stops that the 15 and 15L currently cover. There may be some tweaks at that would ultimately be a decision between Aurora and RTD. Okay, next slide. This is just a graphic that many of you have seen before. Again, just reorient yourself to see how the center running BRT works at intersections. Just a few key topics there. The yellow represent the platforms, the red represent the bus lanes. The platforms are single direction, meaning that the entrance and exit off the buses are always still on the right side of the bus, so they would have no problem functioning in Aurora and elsewhere where they are not in a BRT lane, and they would be in that exterior lane. You can see where, like on that right graphic, the blue bus there is in this graphic headed westbound, but actually on the south side of that platform. Left turns are generally allowed at signalized intersection, and we think that this center running is just a very safe and efficient way to minimize conflict between vehicles and buses, pedestrians and vehicles, and it's been shown to be an excellent way to handle in a corridor like this, even in other corridors nationwide. Okay, next graphic. Okay, you can see that graphic that shows there shows where we had been in 2018 with kind of two different flavors, if you will, that add up together for the total BRT, where the red line there on the bottom heads west out of Civic Center Station on Colfax to Decatur. And go ahead and put the next graphic in there. And you can see now that we have the Colfax BRT will have 3 destinations in Aurora. At the R line at Tower Road with future consideration of an extension to Piccadilly, and at the Aurora Metro Center Station. All 3 of those lines on the west end terminate at Denver Union Station, and Route 16 covers that traffic to the west. Okay. Again, we've covered this, but in the center running section, it was very important to us to have a reasonable distance between stations. There's other considerations too, like is there north-south routes at the location that make sense to connect to? You know, is there a signal at the intersection so that traffic can stop? That, you know, is very beneficial to having a station location. But in general, it's about an average of a 1/3 mile between station, which means a 1/6 of a mile. If you walk to Colfax or get to Colfax somehow coming north or south, and you end up at halfway in between stations, you're only about 3 or 4 blocks in either direction to a station. There's 31 stations between Denver Union Station and the border. Span of service, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The frequency during the day would be approximately on average every 4.3 minutes. At nighttime, it would expand to 20 to 30 minutes headway. Okay. Miles, did you want to cover this one?
Yeah, Brian, I'm happy to. And so as you can see here, the timeline going forward to date is really looking at the preliminary engineering and the environmental review. Those of you who have been following the project know this is not a new concept. We've actually been looking at alternatives for improving mobility and transit on Colfax since about 2012. So that process had really looked at everything from light rail to gondolas to subways, narrowed down to bus rapid transit very early on, obviously. And that concept went into the center running format and brought us to where we are today, which will really start to identify the concepts, the engineering, you know, the environmental work that needs to happen. And then as we move into the 2022 timeframe, looking at coordination with the FTA on some of the small starts funding components and looking at final design within 2023, 2024 timeframe. And the public engagement will continue throughout all of these phases, just as it has done through previous phases as well. That takes us to a construction grant process, probably about 2025, and looking at construction, getting the bus vehicles and testing the system in 2026 and 2028 with the system online and moving people by early 2028. And as we move forward in this process, there are a lot of very important topics that we're really going to be rolling our sleeves up for the next 12 months and digging into with all of you, including traffic operations on Colfax and also the adjacent streets and the mobility benefits of implementing bus rapid transit on Colfax with dedicated transit lanes, the local access and how people go from the transit service, whether they're biking, walking, taking the bus, or driving to access the local neighborhoods and the local businesses, and doing it in a safe and connected way. And also the many streetscape opportunities that this project affords. As we're looking at some of the station planning concepts that you'll see tonight, they have a pretty significant change on the streetscape, bringing back that Main Street feel and improving safety and connectivity. And certainly as we move forward, understanding how any changes are made for all of our communities, especially people who are transit dependent, riding the bus today, folks with disabilities, making sure that this system is a model for equity and accessibility. And certainly the funding that we mentioned as we move forward will be a key component of this that we'll look at in depth as we go into the next phases. And with that, we've got some Q&A coming in. So I am going to turn it over to Alex real quick. Any questions that you can see from our chat?
So I have not had any questions come in yet. So I'd encourage everybody, if you do have questions, please feel free to submit them via chat. You can submit them to any of the hosts. So it's not an open chat where your message will go to everybody. It'll actually just go to the presenters, and then we'll be able to answer your questions as they come in.
Alex, thanks for buying me a little time. There were some chats that were coming in. A really good question about being interested in learning more about safety, especially with regard to having the stations in the center of the street, which can be a little more counterintuitive. But Sid, if we back up a few slides to the overview graphic that Brian was just talking about, what you'll be able to see is that by having the center running stations, it will actually shorten crossing distance. I think if we go one more slide, and it will actually prevent folks from having to cross all of Colfax at one time. It will create that refuge for people who are crossing the street to pause in a very safe center island station before completing their trip across the street, which will improve connectivity across Colfax, which right now can be a challenging street to cross at times. And the designs that we're going to be looking at tonight will really illustrate in a very visual way how those center stations will function so that they are safe and that they do feel comfortable, because it's a concept that we don't have a model for in Denver. So it's a thing where visual and the image speaks 1,000 words. So we'll be able to talk more about the safety components, but this design does prioritize safety for all users. And as you can see, it creates signals where people are allowed to turn left instead of having the free left turns that you'll see on Colfax today. And left turns are one of the leading causes of vehicle crashes. So that is a key component to this plan as well. And then also taking the buses into a dedicated lane that's in the center will reduce those conflicts between parking on the side of the street and the current bus service that runs on the side with vehicle traffic today. So a lot of different components that will improve safety. And a couple other questions we're seeing on the transition from Denver to Aurora. So that's one that we get quite frequently. And Brian, I'll turn that one over to you to describe where we are and what that transition will look like.
Okay, let me see just a couple words, and then I'll probably turn it over to Amber for a little more detail. But so basically, it'll be center running. So if you're going eastbound, it'll be center running until you hit Yosemite, and then probably some kind of signal priority or something like that to allow the bus to then get, as it crosses into Aurora, to then merge over to that outside right lane. Let's see, Amber, do you want to add to that?
Sorry, I was having issues unmuting. No, Brian, you nailed it there. Yes, they will have TSP to get back across traffic and then over to the side running stations through the city of Aurora section.
And then same thing, heading westbound, it would be, I believe the last station at Yosemite would be side running and then cross over to center running as it gets into Denver. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yep,
okay.
That's correct.
And another question we've got here is working with developers to develop the areas around the station so that there's more density, potentially bringing in affordable housing. This is a question we got a lot, and it's also one that is addressed through the neighborhood planning initiative that Denver's community development office just completed. So that's the integrated land use component of the station area planning that will provide opportunities for transit-oriented development around the stations. But Brian, is there anything else you'd like to add on that one?
Just that'll continue to be a public process, as those potential redevelopments move forward. And, we'll be kind of site specific, obviously. But yes, there's certainly an interest in, having the Colfax BRT work with the development that occurs along Colfax.
Excellent. And we've got a lot of other questions coming in. We do have a few other points tonight where we're going to be answering questions. So I want to keep us on an agenda here. I'm going to answer one more question, and it is there a city in which something like this has already been completed? And the short answer is yes. And if you go to colfaxbrt.org, we've got some case studies from other cities up there. But for Brian or Phil and Amber on our design team, are there any example cities that you would use as models for folks to look at as we look at the designs tonight?
Phil, can I ask you to take the lead on this one?
Oh, sure. There are quite a few examples of center running BRT around the country. A couple that come to mind are, for example, in San Bernardino, California. There's about a 5-mile segment there with center running, very similar to the 5.5 miles we're seeing here in Denver. Similarly, in Oakland, California, there's also a center running BRT there. It's a little bit longer. It's about 8 miles. But again, this is a very common kind of BRT configuration. Another one that some people might be familiar with is in Cleveland. It's called the Health Line. And again, it's a little bit more than the length of this quarter, but again, center running with center platforms. It's a very effective way of accommodating BRT in a significant quarter like this.
And a little closer to home, Phil, Albuquerque, is that right?
Albuquerque is another, and for that matter, Fort Collins, that uses the railroad right of way, but people may have seen the Mason Street BRT corridor in Fort Collins as well.
Excellent. Thanks team. And as I said, we've got a lot of good questions coming in. We'll be compiling them and get to as many as we can during our future Q&A breaks. But to keep us on agenda, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to walk us through the summary of our recent public survey, which is still open. And I know she's going to give a plug for that. But if you haven't taken it yet, it's going to be open until the 20th. So you can go and do it online right now. Alex?
Thanks, Miles. Yep, we will include a link to that survey in the chat so you can jump in and take that as soon as we wrap up this evening. But we're really eager to have your feedback there. So if we can go to the next slide. So far, we've received 173 responses from 20 different zip codes. So we are getting really a regional response. Around 58% of our respondents are between the age range of 25 to 44. And so we are interested in trying to engage some of the students that could be riding the line, as well as other people that are using this. So if you have colleagues or friends, please encourage them to take the survey too. We want to make sure we're hearing from everybody. And current public transit use. So in the survey responses we've received so far, varies pretty widely. So 31% have indicated that they use public transit a few times a week or daily. 33% indicated that they use it rarely, a few times a year, and 21% said a few times a month. So lots of opportunity to sort of engage people in public transit a bit more heavily and get their feedback on maybe what needs to be improved in order to do that. Go to the next slide. If you took the survey, you know that we have, in addition to your standard survey multiple choice questions, we also have a map where you could indicate and place a marker of a place that you'd like to improve and a place that you love. We've received 157 comment markers, and the split is about 57% places that you'd like to improve and 43% places that you love. So we can dive into what these actually were flagging. So what you love, there is of course a ton of strong support for the local businesses. So A lot of those specific locations were places where cafes, restaurants, shops, or theaters are located. And a lot of that was really emphasized between Josephine and Madison, the Madison stations. And in addition, people really supported a lot of the existing bike lanes and pedestrian improvements where they have been made, calling out the Syracuse, Pennsylvania, Josephine, and Fillmore intersections. Then they also just, in general, there was a lot of support for the proximity to the amenities and services that the current bus service provides and the connections that are currently available. In terms of where you would like to see some improvements, there was overall a desire to improve traffic flow, especially pedestrian and cyclist safety in many locations. Some people indicated, you know, I've actually had an accident at this location, or I don't feel safe crossing the street. And so that's incredible feedback for us to have and very helpful. And so there were some of those intersections called out that you see on the screen. There's also a strong interest in streetscaping. So there were specific locations where there seemed to be opportunities for enhanced lighting, improved bus shelters, and or placemaking elements. And so some of these locations were identified as, you know, this isn't a great place to wait for a bus. I don't feel super safe here, or this specific shelter doesn't provide very good protection from the weather. So all of that feedback has been helpful in those specific locations that are identified, a couple of them being Cremeria, Monaco, and the Syracuse stations. And then there was also an overall interest in specific locations being good opportunities for increased density and activation. And that really goes back to that feeling of safety. And so waiting at a place that is activated and there's people around and it's well lit is really the goal. And so some of those opportunities where there feels like there are a lot of parking lots or a lot of empty spaces where you may not feel super secure standing, waiting for a bus. So we can jump to the next slide. So the public feedback highlights. So we asked you what your top 3 project benefits were for the Colfax BRT project. And those top 3 things that were identified were increased capacity, better service, and improved safety. But we provided a little bit more context for that. So if you indicated better service, we tagged on that you were interested in reduced travel times and increased service reliability. For improved safety, building enhanced and well-lit stations and shortening pedestrian crossing distances while reducing the number of potential conflicts between people in cars and on foot, like Miles had just spoken to a little bit earlier. And then for increased capacity, we're looking at meeting the current daily ridership needs and being able to serve more riders when more residents and jobs need to use the corridor. And then following these top 3, the 4th was the enhanced public spaces. So just creating more places for activities and creative use and making the corridor a top destination for businesses, residents, and visitors. Go to the next. So following the project benefits, we also asked you what your top concerns were. And so your top concerns, the 50% runaway here is connections to other transit services and bike and pedestrian facilities. So that has been noted by the team, and it's definitely being considered to make sure that this is provides you the connections that you need and the access that you're looking for. In addition, managing traffic to mitigate delays and or diversion of cars to side streets, which I know we'll continue to talk through. And then making sure the project implementation meets community expectation when construction begins. So the feedback that you share with us today and going forward on the station designs and really being clear on what those expectations are will help us achieve these goals and mitigate your concerns. To the next. And so, like I said, and I know many of you are probably waiting for this specific portion of the call. We did ask you, what are the station amenities that you're looking for? And so the top 3 station amenities that you're interested in terms of ranking are shelters that provide shade and or protection from weather events, lighting and security, and then system traveler information. So it's clear you want to feel safe and secure, as well as protected from some of the weather that we get here in Denver, while also knowing when the next bus is going to come. So makes perfect sense. And I think you'll be excited to see what we share next in terms of some of the preliminary station concepts and themes that we're eager to get your feedback on. And like Miles said, of course, if you haven't taken the survey yet, we will share this link here in the chat. We really want to hear from you. It's September 15th. You have until September 20th to share your feedback with us. So we are hopeful that you can take some time and take that survey. If you feel like you're wanting to do some catching up or just want to stay engaged with the project going forward, we do have the virtual engagement hub where you can view clips from our previous meeting in terms of video clips, as well as the presentation that was shared, and all sorts of information on that virtual engagement hub. So you can really get caught up if you feel you need to prior to taking that survey. All right, and next I think we'll open it up for some more of your questions. And I see one that I had come in while I was talking was, can we get the survey link in the chat? And absolutely. So Miles, while you take some questions, I'm gonna get that survey link out to everybody.
Excellent, thanks, Alex. And we just had a question come in. Will the infrastructure, the shelter standards that are used for East Colfax become an RTD standard that get used on other future BRT corridors? That's a great question. And as you look at some of the station designs tonight, you'll see they're relatively unique for anything that we've got here in our system in Denver. And because this project is a partnership between the city and county of Denver and RTD and CDOT and the FTA and the city of Aurora and all of the other partners you saw at the beginning of the presentation tonight, that's a question that's going to need to be addressed. But Brian, our project manager, I think we'll have some thoughts there. And I also want to put Susan Wood on deck from RTD, because I think this is a question that RTD will really need to weigh in on. And RTD, as some of you may know, is doing some near-term improvements to improve shelters on Colfax in the very near future before this project is built. So Brian, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. I mean, definitely Denver is very interested in making this a special corridor. Not that, you know, we don't have other special areas in the city, but we're interested in really having a quality project here, which is why, you know, Denver is in fact spending our money on this, even though the service will be operated by RTD and it's a CDOT facility. In terms of other BRT corridors around the city, it would kind of depend a little bit on the individual situation, but I'll ask Susan to go ahead and speak to that.
All right, I think I'm unmuted, am I?
You are,
Susan.
Oh, yes, very good. Actually, I'm going to echo pretty much what Miles and Brian have both said. This is somewhat of a unique situation and something I think very, very special for the area. And so I believe the stations that are being designed for this project are something we haven't seen before here, which I think is really interesting. So I'm not sure that these will become a standard for RTD, but I definitely think that they will be something that RTD will look to in future years as other BRT projects are considered. Again, I think this is new and unique and something very innovative and different for us here.
Excellent. Thanks, Susan and Brian. And one of the other questions that came into was regarding traffic and you know, looking at what's going to happen to the traffic patterns on Colfax. And as we noted earlier in the presentation, there is some very detailed traffic modeling that's going on right now. And those metrics and that data will be available in probably early 2022 for some of the community workshops that we'll be doing to take a more in-depth look at that. But Brian, I don't know if you have any more context that you'd like to share at this time.
Just totally understand what an important topic that is to people, which is why we're investing so much into a really thoughtful and sophisticated traffic modeling effort here. Don't have a lot to show yet. Obviously, we've had the prior studies that give us a good basis to work on, but yeah, like Miles said, we know that's a big topic. It's coming up here in the next 2 to 4 months to talk with you about. We'll show all our cards. You'll see exactly what we have seen in terms of the results, and we can have the discussion from there. Thanks,
Brian. And time for one more question here. The local business access was another question that came up, and how will this potentially impact businesses? And there's a lot of very good data available out there for many of those same cities that we had mentioned that had done projects like this in the past, in Cleveland and Albuquerque, in San Bernardino. Seattle actually has some really good data that shows transit investments have not only increased development investment in corridors, but they've led to sales tax increases as you've got more transit riders who data has shown spend fewer dollars per trip to one of those local businesses, but they visit those local businesses more frequently, and they actually end up spending more on a year-over-year basis than folks who get to those businesses by car. So we'll have a lot of good data as we start to look at that local access, and we'll clearly need to work very closely with our business community. But it's a good reminder that the 15 and the 15L service on Colfax today is among the busiest transit corridors in our state, moving about 20,000 people per day. So by improving that transit service, those are a lot of potential customers that will, as you'll see tonight, have a much improved experience and the ability to have more frequent bus service where they're not going to need to really look at a bus schedule when you've got buses coming every 5 minutes. So more free time to patronize those local businesses. And we'll get into that in depth as we move through this process. But to keep us on agenda, let's get into the real fun stuff tonight and start to look at our station design concepts. So if we go to the next slide, I'd like to introduce Kevin with Iron Horse Studios to walk us through some of his initial station design concepts, themes, and studies. Kevin.
Hey, thanks, Miles. You're too kind. I want to point out that this has been a huge team effort so far. We've really got a lot of great input from the city and our other stakeholders. So we're really happy to be here. We're pleased to share our progress and some of our initial kind of design thinking with you today. On this slide, you'll see there's maybe we go to the next slide. On this slide, you see there's some sort of key project goals, and I don't want to really get into all the details here, but I think the overarching message is that the bar has been set high for this project, and we've been working really hard to ensure that our initial thinking and ideas are, going to meet the expectations for this exciting project. So generally, we have 3 themes that we're going to share with you today. The themes are kind of these high-level ideas that kind of create a coherent overall design. And then we have 2 station studies for each theme. So there's a total of 6 that we'll be looking at. And I really do want to emphasize that these are studies still. We believe they're really solid, and we're excited about them. But we're looking for feedback as well, because the feedback we get is going to allow them to make them even better as we take them forward. So we haven't solved every little design issue, but we're looking at the kind of higher level design issues about the station canopies, weather protection, safety, lighting, kind of the real key drivers. And I think as we've been doing this, we've heard somebody mention at one point, I think it's really salient, that this is kind of a once in a generation opportunity to create a project of this magnitude that's going to have the ability to maybe inform future BRT projects for the Denver area. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think, great cities have great transit systems. The examples that you see here are both national and international. And what's kind of interesting is if you look at the image of the Paris Metro, it's really kind of efficient and effective. It's not overdone, or the London Tube and Bus. It has a lot to do with smart design ideas. And so we're kind of taking that as a starting point to ensure that, our solutions are cost effective and at the same time exciting. Next, please. Again, maybe not get into all the details here, but there's been a tremendous amount of input that's informed the designs as we've developed them so far. So some of the real key concerns that we heard a little bit earlier, shelters for protection, will demonstrate that, I think. Lighting and security are key. Information, and also, the connection that this will create for a number of neighborhoods, as well as the 2 cities that it connects. And I'm always inspired because if you think about using public transit, you literally use half the amount of energy when you ride the bus you would using a private car. So the more we can make this enticing and comfortable for people, I think the more successful it will be. Next. Again, some of the design objectives that we've touched on in the previous slides, but what's really important, I think, is creating a great user experience for everyone in the community with this project. Next. So the stations are really made up of a bunch of different elements. And at this point in time, our thinking is that there will be a series of kind of consistent elements that you see on the left-hand side of this slide. And then there's also variability. So things like branding that might relate to neighborhoods or to different business improvement districts, public art that might vary, the potential for landscaping, streetscaping, as well as sustainable infrastructure elements. And we'll touch a little bit on that in some of the station design. And then the other kind of, the shelters and windscreens, splash guards, those kinds of things may be more consistent. And that's important from kind of an operations and maintenance standpoint for who's ever maintaining the stations to be able to change things out quickly if there's any, failures with the light fixture or they need to update a bench or something like that. Next.
So building off of what Kevin had just shared in terms of what elements could potentially be variable in terms of the design, we know that this is something that communities are likely to be excited about. And so we wanted to ask a poll question here. So let me get that launched. Okay, so yeah, we want to hear from you. So what station elements would you be most eager to customize in your local area? So just like we saw on that last slide, the options are branding, public art, landscaping, or sustainable infrastructure elements. So just around 56% of you have participated so far. We'll give everyone just a couple more seconds. And then I'll share the results. Right now, it's looking like public art is coming out ahead. Okay. Thanks to everyone who participated. I'll share those results now. So it's a bit split. I think people are really excited about the public art opportunity as well as sustainable infrastructure elements and landscaping. We'll have more to come on branding, but this is helpful for us. So thank you to all who participated. All right. Okay. Kevin, I will hand it back over to you. Sid, if you want to head to the next slide.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So this is kind of giving a few kind of technical issues I just want to point out that's common to all the station designs. But as was talked about earlier, it's primarily center running. So the platforms are in the middle of the street, like many streetcar systems around the world, as well as some of the other BRT stations that Phil mentioned. The platforms are typically sized for 2 large buses, and there are 2 platforms, around each intersection. The shelters, as you'll see here, mostly are modular, and they can be sized by need. So if it's further out somewhere on the line, it may be shorter to begin with, but expanded in the future as ridership picks up. The platforms, that the kind of yellow band through the middle of this image are raised to allow for level boarding. So there's a very slight accessible entry. At the crosswalk, you move up 14 inches onto this platform, and then you move directly into the buses. And that makes, what we've done is actually exceeded barrier-free requirements. So it creates a really easy and simple transition up to that platform and eliminates handrails and those sorts of things. So that's kind of a quick technical summary. Next. Let's see. So as we were developing the themes, we wanted to kind of tap into our unique place in the world. So the thematic ideas were built kind of on the region, on the cities, Aurora and Denver, and then on Colfax Avenue itself. And we developed these themes that we hope they resonate with people and are evident, so that when people are riding this BRT, they know it's a part of our community and our city and our region. Next. So we had sort of 3 themes that we developed, and I'll describe them in a little bit more detail as we get into them. But one was Rewind, which kind of looks a little bit at the history of Colfax. The second was rays of light, pick us up on the idea as Denver is one of the sunniest cities in the United States, and then also playful landmarks. So these are pretty broad, but they allow a lot of latitude as we've been developing station ideas. So next slide, please. I'm sorry, okay. So looking at the Colfax Avenue and its history, we wanted to pick up on some of those ideas, but we also wanted to reinterpret that a little bit and look to the future. So these are some of the images looking back historically. The next slide, please. So the notion of rewind kind of acknowledges the history, celebrates movement, since Colfax has always been about moving towards the west. The transitions that have taken place over time in Colfax, and at the same time begins to look at sort of modern architectural ideas. And this is very abstract, but there's a lot of materials that we'll be looking at in terms of steel, concrete, stone, wood, glass. All those things are really open here. Today, I do want to emphasize too, all of our studies are still sort of white and abstract. There's some materiality that's implied, but we haven't really gotten down and sort of fine-tuned that yet. So we haven't really begun to look at color and those sorts of things yet, because I think those are going to tie in very much with branding at the end of the day. So we're working through that. So our first option, sort of rewind conceptual study A, has a very strong roof form. It's linear, kind of suggesting movement and transition. And it's also highly modular, so we can make the canopies longer or shorter as based on the particular activity in a given station. Next image, please. So this is kind of moving down to eye level now. And if you look at the kind of circle in the upper left on this slide, there's kind of this beautiful piece of modern architecture. And you can see how that's beginning to resonate and be carried through in kind of a new way, something that's unique for Colfax and for this BRT. The forms are fluid and kind of elegant. Next slide, please. This is looking as if you're coming across the crosswalk up onto the canopy. You can see there's a really good amount of protection from sun, rain, snow, sleet. We've got windscreens all along the back side of the canopy and splash guards all along there as well. So it's very open and secure feeling, but at the same time provides a great deal of protection. And that's something that you'll see in most of the solutions, actually in all the solutions. Next slide, please. This is looking now to the west. We haven't modeled all the background yet. We're still kind of keeping things abstract, but if you know the city, you'll know this is Pennsylvania Avenue. So you see how these two canopies then relate and kind of dialogue across the intersection. It's almost a little bit like, in this case, these are sort of clouds moving down through the avenue. Next slide, please. Here's a dusk view. Again, this is a study. We're kind of thinking about lighting and thinking about Colfax because it's really 24/7. Light will be an important element, creating both identity for the BRT as well as a really good sense of security for people using the stations at night. Next slide. So moving on to concept B, or study B. Again, it's a very strong roof form. There's a real opportunity to take that element and create the iconography for this line. It's very expansive and expressive. Next slide. Again, the little bubble in the upper left, you can kind of see some of the precedents that we've been looking at, but kind of interpreting it in a new way. There's really great weather protection with this option as well, and really great transparency. So if you're on the platform, you can see, you can be seen, you can say, oh great, there's a coffee shop over there. I know another bus is coming in 4.3 minutes. I'm gonna run over and get a cappuccino, I'll be back. Next slide, please. Again, looking from that crosswalk view, the way this roof forms, it really invites you in. So you can be out at the ends when, if you want a little more openness and connection to the environment, or you can move in closer where it's a little bit more constrained and covered. Next slide. Again, looking west and seeing those two canopies and how they kind of create a dialogue and a sense of movement and through the corridor. And in that night view, which I think is going to be very important. And I think this is kind of nice. You can really see how much protection is being provided, how that splash guard along the back that's low. We're going to provide a lot of seating, and both accessible seating and typical seating, and then that back windscreen. And then we're also starting to think about including, wayfinding maps, maps for orientation of where you are in the city, and then information displays that'll tell you when the next bus is coming in, those sorts of things. Next slide, thanks. The second theme, we'll have two options or two studies here, was Rays of Light. Again, celebrating the notion of Denver and 320 days of sunshine every year, as well as light is fast, right? And I think that helps reinforce the notion that this is going to be a really efficient and effective BRT system. Next slide. Again, kind of some of the early abstract thinking, but you can see the different ways that light may be used in some of our inspirational images here. We're thinking about these being kind of horizontal and linear ideas, connected and continuous, and light may be used in different ways, both sunlight and artificial light, as we develop the designs. Next slide, please. This first concept is really highly modular. You'll note on this little study, there's a series of photovoltaic arrays, and we're evaluating that. And initial studies seem to indicate that each station would have enough PV to support its own electrical needs, which could be really kind of unique and exciting. And we're really looking at that for all the solutions. Here's one where it just was really obvious to add it and pretty easy to add it in. So we wanted to demonstrate that. Next slide. Again, if you look at that image on the upper left and this kind of streaks of light, they're almost like headlights moving down a dark street in the evening. We've kind of taken that and began to pull that through this canopy that wraps and provides protection. There's lots of options. And I think that's one thing I want to stress. We've got kind of an initial idea here, but there's always variations and hybridizations and things we can look at. So as we're getting input, we'll continue to kind of build on that richness of the design going forward. This is a really strong kind of contemporary design, and in a nice way, it really contrasts with some of the history and Colfax. This slide gives you a good indication of the amount of coverage. This option might provide kind of more kind of protection from sun than some of the others, but there's always going to be plenty of weather protection. Next slide, please. Again, looking back west, and it's almost like, that these two hands kind of enclosing and protecting you when you're out on the platform from traffic and from weather. It's kind of an embrace, kind of a little hug for people. Next slide. This kind of evening view again. Just an initial study about the lighting. We're not sure this is the right way to do it yet or not, but it's going to be a really important thing as we get into it. The next slide. So this is concept sort of study B. It's a strong arch, and then the canopy above you is really hung from above. It's a little bit, we were envisioning like kind of the sun rising, coming up over the horizon and beginning to spread light down Colfax. Next slide, please. There's an image on the upper left that you kind of get the idea of the simplicity of the structure and the strength of the structure. Next slide, please. And here you can see that the platform itself is really very open, and even though there's still a lot of protection above you and behind you. That next slide. And the arch actually inclines a little bit to kind of create this dynamic dialogue between the two platforms across an intersection. Next slide, please. This is again demonstrating the kind of dusk view. And another sort of important comment, we've modeled this initially thinking about the canopies being glass. When we were meeting with some disability advocates, they were talking about the need for sort of acoustical control in these stations. So we might look at something that's got, you know, an acoustical surface up there instead of glass. It could be more opaque and solid. Maybe it's a wood, maybe it's an acoustical effect that absorbs noise, things like that. So these are still pretty early. You know, I think they really demonstrate the ideas and the concepts, but there's a lot of variability we can get into. Next theme is playful landmarks. You know, looking at around Denver at some of the icons that suggest play. Thinking about Colfax Avenue is kind of a place of fun, depending where you are on the avenue. When people go there to socialize, they're looking for entertainment, they're shopping, they're dining. And the idea of kind of these playful landmarks kind of ties into the history, I think, of Colfax Avenue. Next slide. So, you know, we're thinking about kind of whimsy and liveliness and fanciful and maybe kind of some lighthearted ideas. Next, so this is the conceptual study A. It's a simple and kind of modular idea. If we go to the next slide, kind of moving down to street level, you know, the notion of taking the vertical structure that's supporting these canopies and kind of breaking it down into smaller pieces. So it's almost like a series of birch trees and sort of, you know, clouds going through, or maybe a mist in the mountains going through. So it really relates to the region, you know, the mountains, but at the same time, city parks. So maybe it's a bit like a, you know, a linear park that's kind of running down the center of Colfax. Next slide, please. You know, the shelter, it still provides a lot of shelter. And you can get the sense here of maybe the little cluster of trees that are supporting the canopies. Next slide. This is a view looking west, but again, they're providing a lot of shelter for patrons on the platforms. Next slide. That dusk view, and you know, here we're kind of looking at maybe that ceiling plane, that ceiling surface, potentially being a little bit reflective, and that would really reflect the action and movement of the city around it, whether it's people or cars or buses, and, you know, provide a sort of sense of kinetic movement against this reflective surface. Next concept study B for playful landmarks. This one, you know, we're kind of abstractly thinking it's almost like bus routes on a map, and we've kind of taken those things and extruded them. It's also modular, it can be longer, a little bit shorter. Next slide, please. That's kind of that view from street level. It's very open and fairly dynamic. We're still looking at the amount of, you know, what's solid and what's sort of really open here, but gives a good idea. Next slide. Looking in again as you're crossing the intersection. The form and the structure have really merged in this particular solution. I think the panels could potentially provide, they provide weather protection, but also an opportunity for branding or the inclusion of wayfinding signage and additional lighting. Next slide. You can kind of see that at night as well. So I think to bring it all back together, we've really looked at a variety of options. I think we're exceptionally pleased to be able to share with you know, this kind of initial design thinking with you today. There's those three broad themes: rewind, and rays of light, and then playful landmarks. There's the two studies of each, so it shows you that things are still fluid, and there's a lot of variety, and there's, you know, opportunities for hybridization, kind of mixing things together. So we're looking forward to the discussion and feedback. And I think there's one final comment. I really want to thank the city for their desire to create an inspired solution for the Colfax BRT and for Denver. I think it's really an exciting opportunity. So Miles, back to you.
Thanks, Kevin, and great overview of it. With that, we've got some discussion that we'd like to have, and we've got a really fun app that will allow you to drop some pins and provide some feedback. So if we go to the next slide here, Alex can begin to tee us up, and we're going to drop this into the chat, and then you can start filling it out, and we'll start to address some of those questions that we've been receiving in the chat. We've got a lot of very good ones.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Miles. Yep, so I just shared this link in the chat. So if you follow this most recent link, it will take you to Social Pinpoint. Oh, sorry, the sun is blinding me. But if you follow this link, you'll see the Social Pinpoint that looks very similar to the survey. But what this is that you'll be provided with the summary of each of the themes. And we'd love for you to place one of these markers or one of each of these markers. There's no limit to identify something that you like, something that stands out to you. If you have an idea to further enhance or improve any of these themes, please share those with us. And then, of course, share any of your comments or questions, and we will jump into that Social Pinpoint tool and track some of that feedback now. So Sid, if we want to switch over, and then Miles, I'll hand it to you if you want to talk through some of the questions and feedback we've already received via chat.
Yeah, perfect. And we've got so many great ones. One question I wanted to address right out of the gate, we've been getting a few questions on schedule and the question of, why is it taking 7 more years to implement? And it's a very good question. And I'd like to flip it to our DOTI Transit Director, David Krutzinger. And David, hopefully your audio is functioning.
All right, can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Great. Yeah, we appreciate the question, and we know many of you have been with us for many years looking at this corridor. It does take some time to get some of the federal funding that is necessary to do some of these really cool things that Kevin was just showing you at the stations. So we wanted to provide a conservative implementation schedule, and we will also be looking for opportunities to accelerate that if we possibly can. So look forward to continuing to work with folks and turn this into reality as soon as we can.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And Kevin, it sounded like you were actually getting some questions to you via chat. So let us know if there's anything in there, but I'll give you some time to sort through that. Well, you do though. One question for you. Questions about the weather and will these different station concepts relatively equally provide protection from the elements? And do we consider things like seasonal direction of glare for safety, and how do you incorporate that type of design component into some of these concepts, and then how does that translate into the ultimate detailed design?
Okay, I think we've been hearing a lot of the public feedback, and shelters and protection from the elements has been really key. So that's really been baked into all these solutions. In terms of a continuous splash guard at the back of the platforms, weather screening that's extending from that splash guard up typically to the top of the canopy on the backside as well. We're beginning to incorporate wind screens as well along the platform that provide a space for people to kind of tuck into if the wind's blowing east or west. Stay out of the way. And then I think once we begin to really hone in on one of these, we'll kind of fine tune all those smaller details, the type of glass or plexiglass, the amount of transparency, how we're going to be providing, for example, in the one ray of light option, we've got a glass canopy. If everybody loved that and were to go forward with that, we'd figure out a way to build in the amount of frit so that it's providing a lot of shade, but still that sense of openness. So those other details I think are going to be studied as we kind of refine the designs further and work into it. But I think at the high level, so far all these have really sort of addressed the kind of key weather protection and protection from sleet and snow as cars and buses go by.
Excellent, good to know. And I think that speaks to the importance of the future meetings we'll be having at the more neighborhood level to really go more in depth on some of those details. And also we've gotten a lot of questions about safety, and because the center median stations are a relatively new concept, especially here in Denver, we don't have anything we can go and take a look at that's really comparable. We'll be in these future meetings coming up this fall, be able to go in more depth on some of these concepts and really show how by shortening the crossing distances, it really is making it safer to cross Colfax. Right now, you cross Colfax, you've got to cross 4 lanes of traffic, turning lane in the middle, 2 lanes of parking. It's quite a stretch, especially for people with disabilities. By shortening that distance by effectively half or more than half, it will make it easier for people to cross. If they're not able to move quite as quickly and need to wait for a second cycle in the traffic lights, they'll be able to do that. Otherwise, in this, there'll be plenty of time in the single traffic and pedestrian cycle to stop, pause, make sure you can cross safely. And it'll also be slowing down traffic to the speed limit, which facilitates a safe crossing as well. So in some of those future meetings, we'll be able to go deeper on some of the lighting, the safety, the weather and the elements, and then how these designs will address that. But Alex, it looks like we've got some good comments coming in. So hopefully I bought you enough time to get a little summary here.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And thanks to all of you so much for participating. We have a really good mix of the different types of feedback that we're getting. So in terms of some of the feedback that you're liking on the playful landmarks, we're seeing some support for the structures mimicking the trees and the poles serving as lights and reflecting on the ceiling, being such a magnet for attention to draw people and draw them to actually start considering riding the buses. And then we also got some feedback or some concerns that with playful landmarks too, there's some concern that it may not be able to stand up to the use of the corridor in terms of just how intricate the designs are. So lots of good feedback coming in. And then also highlighting some on the rays of light, people highlighting that they think that some of the designs will help to promote a sense of security through the canopy extension in the horizontal and vertical directions. But Kevin, I think I'm going to be excited to hand this over to you. I think this is going to be a lot of good feedback that you'll be able to incorporate and consider. And a lot of people are really liking the idea of the overhead lighting featured in many of these designs.
Terrific. Yeah, this is great comments.
Yeah.
And we'll be keeping this survey open as we go into some of those neighborhood meetings this fall that I was mentioning earlier. A couple other questions coming through in the chat. Really quickly, a question about branding and what that'll look like. And we're not there yet, but the spoiler alert is that we will be dedicating some time in this process to get into branding and get some community feedback on that as well. And as you can see, this is such a unique corridor. We're really looking forward to this discussion. And Brian, this may be a question for Amber, but I'll flip it to you first. Question about the number of intersections that we're going to see in the corridor with transit signal priority for the buses.
Well, our current plan is really to use that as a tool to allow the buses to jump in front of other traffic when they need to change from one lane to another. That would not necessarily preclude it on the other parts of the corridor, but I think our thinking is, and the modeling would show that with the dedicated lane and with really good signal timing and with the really tight frequency of service, that we think that just, you know, a good traffic signal timing along the corridor would really allow that bus to get the priority it needs, especially in that dedicated lane.
Excellent, thank you. And one more for you and Susan, maybe RTD would want to weigh in on this one. Question about snow removal on these stations and how that would be managed.
Yeah, I can start with that for sure. I would anticipate that snow removal at the stations would take place just as it does at all of our stations, where we have facilities folks who are dedicated to do just that task. Certainly on really heavy snow days, that happens a little slower than all of us would like, but they are always at work on any snow day to make sure that happens. And this would be accomplished in the same way.
Excellent. And one more question on amenities at the station. Really a couple good questions on safe bike parking and how would we be able to potentially incorporate bike boxes? You know, would they maybe need to be on the side of the street or in the center of the street, because we know there's constrained space in those center stations. How do we think about those types of features? Maybe Kevin, I think you might want to take a first crack at that one in terms of managing the limited space we've got there.
Yeah, and I think I'd like Phil to weigh in on this one too. But I mean, most of the discussions thus far have been about people taking their bikes on the buses or attached to the buses as opposed to leaving them somewhere. The platforms are relatively narrow. There might be the potential, we could look at that, of getting some shelters at the very back end of the platforms out of the way. But Phil, maybe you might have some thoughts on that as well.
Sure, Kevin. And of course, most people who use a bicycle to get to the bus from their origin would also need the bicycle to get off the bus and get to their destination, kind of the first mile, last mile connection, either by walking or bicycling. So as Kevin said, we're anticipating inclusion of onboard bike racks that will accommodate a couple of bicycles and allow exactly that kind of first, last mile connection.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin and Bill and Alex. It looks like we're still getting some great comments. What do we have that's new and exciting?
Yeah, so people are really interested in the lighting. There's a lot of support for how lighting is incorporated throughout. There's also some momentum for potential solar. And there's been a couple of mentions of solar within the rays of light and a lot of support for that. I think people are really eager for the protection that could be offered from some of these shelters in terms of protection from the elements. There were some questions about the holes. So for example, in one of the studies for rays of light, it shows some of the interesting design, including some holes in the back of the shelter itself where people would sit behind them. And so there is some concern of would this allow for rain or cold air to come through. So just some things to consider there. And then a lot of support for whichever provides the most shade, especially in the summer months, a little break from the heat and the persistent Denver sun. Some support for wayfinding throughout and making sure that people know. And this is also indicated in our survey that we shared. People are wanting to know when buses are coming and exactly where they're located. Also, some comments around branding and how the different branding elements for the bids and the communities that the stations are located in, how those variable elements will fit in with some of these designs. But overall, it's looking like a lot of positive feedback and a lot of good excitement around a number of the designs. So, and I think there's a lot of good opportunity. I know we mentioned this earlier, but for the combination of some of this feedback. So, and sort of sharing that none of these are totally final, and that's why we're coming to you and asking for this feedback and information. So really highlighting the things you like in each of these themes will be most helpful for the team as they can try to incorporate those and see where we can really achieve what the public is asking for.
Thanks, Alex. And Brian, a good question for you here in the chat. Really a love of the wayfinding, some of the real-time info, but especially the sustainability elements, the energy generation from potential solar systems. How would we incorporate these station designs into meeting the city's sustainability goals?
Certainly we have a number of goals as relates to sustainability. I think that'll be a factor we look at. I mean, we do have to consider the maintenance aspects and the capital cost of putting those features in place, but the city's highly interested in being innovative and looking at that way to reduce, our carbon footprint. So I think it's something that we're just going to be looking at as we get further into the design process.
Absolutely. And another good topic for discussion as we get into some of those more detailed planning workshops to show the community prioritization of those green elements, and also a good plug for why this project is such a good candidate for Colfax, because you've got 20,000 people riding the bus today. With a system like this, it can move even more people, meaning people will be able to move more efficiently through sustainable transportation. And that's probably one of the biggest environmental impacts and benefits we'll have with this project, is being able to shift trips from vehicles to transit.
Yeah, and when you do that, you literally use half as much energy, which is pretty phenomenal. At the highest level, that's pretty significant. But I think, these stations are sort of larger and have the capacity to be even larger than, your typical bus stop. So more people are going to be able to get in there and feel protected when it's raining, snowing, or sunny. And hopefully that'll, increase ridership.
Absolutely, Kevin. And whether it's the bike box on the side street or bringing your bike on the bus, this is a model of sustainable transportation here. Alex, I want to toss it back to you and see what additional comments we've been seeing on the fun stuff, the design itself.
Yeah, so we do have a question, and this was just from somebody wondering, will the bus lanes be slightly raised at different stops? So wanted to throw that back to maybe Phil and Kevin, if any of the lanes will be raised.
I think, just to be clear, the platforms that people are standing on before they get on the bus are all raised 14 inches. So it provides level boarding, right? If you've gone from the street level, you've gone up to the platform level, and you get directly into the bus. Is that what the question was about?
I think so. And so this question was, it was put in a general spot sort of on the on one of the designs. And so I was just wondering if where the raise is going to occur. So I think you answered it though. Thank you.
Yeah, and I might just chime in. The lane itself would not be significantly raised over the traffic lane adjacent to it. We would need to keep those basically on a relatively level plane in case there needs to be shifts around for construction or if there's an incident or something like that. But Kevin's exactly right. This would be really sweet that once you're on the platform, you literally just walk straight onto the bus without any steps.
Yeah, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but there would be some paint and markings in the bus lane to indicate that that's the bus lane. And the real sweet thing there that you mentioned is that level boarding. So people on wheelchairs, people with strollers, it'll be a much easier boarding and unboarding experience there.
Correct.
And it's probably worth mentioning too that we've made that transition from street level to platform, as I alluded to earlier. It's actually less than a typical barrier-free ramp. So it's actually easier for anyone to navigate if they have any sort of mobility issues. So we're trying to make this as accessible as possible.
Yeah, and just got a question in the chat on this theme, thinking about overhead lighting and making sure that there's easily identifiable lane demarcations to help drivers and bus drivers know what the correct right-of-way looks like. Will there be some overhead signalization to dedicate the bus lanes as well for folks in cars? And Brian, I guess this is maybe a question for you.
It was the question whether there would be overhead signs or overhead signals designating where the buses and cars would be?
Precisely.
We haven't gotten to that phase of the project yet where we've worked out that sort of signage that would occur. I don't know that I don't know honestly yet. There would certainly be markings on the pavement, certainly signs on the side of the road, so it'd be very clear to cars and buses where they're supposed to go. In terms of any kind of overhead sign, certainly at the intersections, it would likely be a sign next to the signal. I don't know that there would be any other overhead demarcation.
Perfect, Brian. Thank you so much. And this is another city question. Regarding connectivity to the existing and planned system, for this major transit investment that moves so many people on Colfax, connecting to some of the light rail stations, Denver Union Station that you showed on the map. How's the city thinking about connecting to existing and then future planned high capacity transit systems and BRT corridors?
Well, this is all part of our mobility plan, but I'm going to turn it over to David Krutzinger. David, weigh in on this one?
Sure. We know big picture that the city is growing. We're going to be adding a lot of residents and a lot of jobs over the next 20 to 30 years, but our streets are not going to get a whole lot wider in most of the city. And so transit is a key solution to moving more people, as we'll also be doing bike lanes and other things like that on parallel streets to increase the movement of people and make it as easy for folks to get around as possible.
Excellent. Thank you both. And Alex, I want to go back to our pretty pictures one more time. Are there any additional comments coming in there?
Yeah, so there have been some creative comments around employing the colors of the sunrise and sunset. So a couple of people have flagged incorporating like reds and orange and yellows to align with some of the designs. So that's some fun feedback. And then there's also been a couple of comments on wondering how, depending on which design is chosen, if any of these themes or where we end up going is if that is going to fit within the timeline that has already been established. I think there's some concern that, well, these look great and people are excited, they want to make sure that they're not extending the length of time before BRT is available.
Awesome, Alex. And Kevin, one more question to you, and then we'll keep moving so we stay on time here in the agenda. What about, we heard a little bit about, there was, folks were really excited and liked the idea for real-time information, the off-board ticketing. What other types of amenities that you mentioned earlier can we expect to see here, just in terms of making these stations kind of more of a rail-like experience?
Okay, well, there will be ticket vending machines on each platform. So as you come up at the top of the ramp, typically it'll be right there. So that'll make it fairly simple. We're going to have a lot of wayfinding built in. So there'll be the information displays, which again, we haven't incorporated yet in the design, but those are essentially video monitors that'll give you real live update information on the flow of the buses. We'll have route maps at each station, and then we'll have general wayfinding maps at each station. So if you've alighted at this station, new to Denver, you can kind of look exactly where you are in the city and figure out where you need to go. And I think, we're going to have there's going to be a lot of seating built in, so it'll be very comfortable. Hopefully nobody's ever going to have to sort of push somebody out of the way to sit down on one of the benches. And then again, I think the overall feel of these is going to be different from the typical station. I think that, the city's been very insightful about kind of creating that, more welcoming, kind of more, grand scaled station, more like, rail stations or the rail stations we think of from the past.
Excellent. That's a really good insight into what to expect, and really what makes bus rapid transit so rapid is that off-board ticketing. You'll be able to buy your ticket off the bus and you get on and away you go. So Alex, unless there are any additional comments, I think we can move on.
I think we covered them, but if you are, so like we said, we will be keeping this open beyond this meeting. So if you have additional comments later, feel free to come back to the link and provide that feedback. The other item that I want to make everybody aware of is that you do have the option, you can see it in the bottom right-hand corner of each of the comments. If there's something that you support, you can like it or dislike it, and that'll sort of help weigh some of the comments too. But thank you so much everybody for participating. I'm eager to share your feedback with the team, and we'll take a close look at it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alex. And I want to like all of those comments. I mean, just at a glance, there's a lot of good input. So thank you so much for that. And this survey will stay open throughout the fall as we continue to share these designs with the broader community. We'll also be putting this information up on colfaxbrt.org very, very quickly here before the end of the week, so that it's easily shareable and easily accessible. And if we move on to the next slide. So where we go from here, we took a look at the schedule, and quick recap that the project schedule is moving very quickly. We've got some good momentum and a very clear and defined process for this effort, starting with the preliminary engineering that we're seeing tonight and moving into that project development phase, getting our design finalized, and then getting this thing into construction so it can start moving people as soon as possible. And what you'll see on the next slide is just ways to stay engaged. We've mentioned them a few times tonight that there are going to be some station design workshops throughout this fall. We'll be going into more of a neighborhood scale conversation and having some more focused discussions on specific station concepts and how they relate to different intersections. So stay tuned for more information on that. The survey that Alex shared earlier that we're wrapping up, but it's still open until September 20th. So 5 more days to get your feedback in there. And you can access all of this information and check out all of the amazing street art on Colfax at the virtual engagement hub that's accessible via colfaxbrt.org. And so we're 5 minutes to 7 here. We've gotten a lot of great questions. I know my chat has slowed down significantly, but I want to open it up for any of the other project team members who may have had questions submitted directly to you that we need to address, and feel free to unmute and ask your questions. maybe we've addressed them all. I know we've covered a lot of ground tonight. So with that, I think we can wind things down. Alex, was there any additional questions that you had seen via the chat?
I think we've spoke to most of them. I know one that came in earlier was, are there any opportunities to increase or sort of speed up the process, so speed up the timeline that we're just looking at? So if Brian, if you could speak to that, if there are any of those opportunities to get this done in action before 2028.
Sure. Well, we as a city are highly interested in doing just that. I mean, the sooner we get this in place, the sooner we start bringing some alleviation to traffic around the whole city as part of a larger transit system. So we're very motivated to do that. There's a few complications and allow me to be bureaucratic here for just a minute to make a big project like this happen. We do have other agency partners. So the road is actually a CDOT highway. The transit service is offered by RTD. We're seeking federal funding, so we have the Federal Transit Administration working with us. All are great partners, but it just takes a little more time sometimes to get through each step of the phase. We're right now in an environmental process, which is a federally mandated process for a project like this, to get that clearance to be able to spend federal funds on a corridor like this. And there's very prescriptive requirements to ensure that agencies take a lot of public input, that they really consider the pros and cons, the benefits and costs or performance of different alternatives, and as refine the alternative to make it as good as it can be and as cost effective as it can be. So we're in that process right now. And then when we seek federal funding, there's a very specific process on how we seek that funding. And it's sort of a multi-stage, multi-year process that occurs over. So all of that is a long way of saying that we're very anxious. We're just as anxious as you are, but we do have to go through some process here. We've already had a number of meetings just over the last couple months within Denver and some of our partners to look at ways to accelerate. And we do think we have some ideas. I mean, as you see in our schedule, we're looking at being open for revenue service in 2028. That does sound like a very long ways away. But we are looking for opportunities to shave a year or two off of that with some really creative parallel processes and, getting some things going sooner rather than later, betting that other things will happen to line up with those things. So we're working hard, and, we'll know a lot more in a year than we know now about the schedule, but I'm confident that we're going to beat that 2028 revenue schedule.
Brian, thank you so much for the thorough answer. And I think you actually answered it so thoroughly that it generated one more question about whether or not an EPA study has been completed. And I know the Federal Transit Administration, the FTA, has jurisdiction over this one, so the environmental work would happen under that agency's umbrella. But please elaborate if there's anything more that we need to say.
Oh, that's exactly right, Miles. We're under the National Environmental Policy Act. You'll hear it referred to as a NEPA study. There's various levels of environmental clearance under that act. The highest level is an environmental impact statement, when you're going to have tremendous impacts to some natural resource or a cultural resource and you can't mitigate them, all the way down to what's called a categorical exclusion, which means that your impacts are much lower, but you still have a process to go through to document how the alternative performs and what the impacts are. We're in that lowest, basically close to the lowest level of environmental clearance, because we're not going to have a lot of heavy negative impact or physical impact on property or resources. So it is a process that the EPA weighs in on, but it is in this case governed by the Federal Transit Administration.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. And I think with that, we're at the 2-minute, now the 1-minute warning. So I want to thank everyone for coming and turn it back over to our project manager, Brian Pinkerton, for a final thought and to adjourn us.
All right. Well, again, thank you all so much for taking your time to spend with us this evening. We're We're really excited about the project. I can feel a lot of energy in the comments we're getting. Don't forget to do that survey if you haven't already. Look for a lot more coming from us over the next several months. We're going to have more of these community workshops and more opportunity to talk. You know, I can certainly commit to you on behalf of Denver, that's the way it's going to be all the way as we go through this project development. There's going to be a lot of opportunity to listen to you and incorporate your thoughts, because the city of Denver is highly interested in making this a really outstanding project. As we spoke about before, maybe a once in a generation opportunity to really take Colfax, which is already something special and great, and turn it into something even greater for the next 50 to 100 years. So thank you again for your time tonight.